This is the last concluding session of this conference, and we planned this in a way to have an extra room for discussion. I mean, you all realized that the theme of the conference was to really provide room for going more into depth into every single presentation, and now we want to have a little bit of space where we can think about how to bring the things together, to look back, but also to look forward and to think about what we can discuss about future avenues which might have opened up for you. And so I invite Stefanie to join us, Steve Ross, and then let's start. Maybe if I can squeeze. Thank you. Yeah, I have the mic. So, just to maybe start this off before I hand over to my co-conspirators here, I just wanted to say I can't do, or I don't want to do justice to all of the presentations which had each and every one very interesting insights. I just wanted to raise some themes here and to maybe push or start the discussion. So what I found really important as a result of all the presentations is that in many ways, in many presentations, the insights complicated our pictures, and they actually helped to also debunk certain myths, certain kind of traditional conceptions, which kind of in some places really transformed into misperceptions, and so I thought this was an important result already. I thought also that in the end, we found some themes in the importance of the individual, the agency of the individual, also transnational phenomena, which we can kind of look at people crossing borders, but also we talked about sources crossing borders, perception crossing borders. So there were a lot of kind of these transnational themes there, which also helped us to kind of, in a way, to reconceptualize, rethink themes, but also terms. We started with this in the conference, and so I think it was actually nice to end up also to rethink with these terms in the last presentations. And so I think this was helping us to, again, to question them, challenge them, and I think just the act of challenging terms already helps us to kind of deepen our understanding of the actual events. So I'm very appreciative of this. And then I thought, which is a kind of a very banality, that the comparison actually also help us to not only complicate but also to deepen our understanding of these events. And so this is what I had. I'm also a little bit tired, I have to say. But it is just to start off a discussion, and now I hand over to Stefanie maybe first.
Okay. I would like to start quoting our Chancellor, or still Chancellor Angela Merkel, who after a night meeting with, I think it was Sarkozy, and then they had to go in the morning, they had to go to the press at 8 in the morning or 7 in the morning, and the microphones were on, and so everybody could hear that Sarkozy was asking her, "Are you tired?" And she said, "Tired? No." That's my comment to you.
Gender to mention there.
Men like to complain. And especially
the leader of the species.
Well, I'll not continue commenting on this. I would just, actually I only have 2 points to make. I was very much intrigued also by the last panel and by, again, seeing or listening to how powerful a symbol the Holocaust has become as a symbol and in wording, and Kristallnacht and Auschwitz and all these topics that came up. And I think we all know why this is so, I think, and I think it's also, it's a kind of, if you want to be, I think you said it, yeah, if you want to be heard, you have to use these strong words in order for an injustice or murder to be listened to, you know, and I think if we feel a little bit uneasy with this, it's our duty to take other mass murder serious, you know, without those words being used. I think so. It's like more a challenge to us, and it's our, let's say, how do you say, vernachlässigung, neglect? Yeah, neglect, ignorance and neglect. If we force all the others to use these words, I don't know. We cannot turn this back. I think this is culturally so much ingrained now, but I think it's a good reminder of our own, like, very one-sided or one, you know, not very broad view in many respects. But, and then on the other hand, I think this uneasiness also, of course, has to do that we conceive or we consider the Kristallnacht, to use this term now, as a prehistory of the Holocaust. And of course it was a prehistory, and it is the prehistory of the Holocaust, and it is connected to the Holocaust. And one thing that I think is important in that respect is that in Holocaust history, like, the usual narrative is that, I mean, you had 1938 was all the events, and then the outbreak of the war, terror in Poland, and then the Holocaust in itself, I mean, the Holocaust, properly speaking, starts in 41, and it starts with the Einsatzgruppen not only killing Jewish men, rounding up Jewish men, but also killing women and children. And this is like the taboo and the Zivilisationsbruch, the break of civilization, and as Dina has termed it, and this is like what makes it unprecedented and special and so on. But if we take our own findings of Kristallnacht serious, then this taboo is happening in 38, in German cities. It's happening at home, so to speak. And I think this is very important, because all the explanations that we've been given for the Holocaust, it could only happen in the war. It was a special situation. It was a fixed image of the enemy, of Untermenschen, Soviet, like Slavic, whatever. I mean, there are so many explanations, and then you have the how do you say, the compulsion of comradeship, and so, I mean, Christopher Browning, all these excellent books who have always focused on 41, and I think if we really look at 38, we really have to reconsider it, because they were killing old women in German towns, in their neighborhoods. It were not the young, I mean, many of the perpetrators were young Nazis, I mean, members of Nazi organizations, but not all of them. Some went against their neighbors. So I think we have to reconsider our conceptualization of what happens in 41 and what is so special about it. And I think this was, for me, I think, the most important lesson also from this conference here. Thank you. I can get people.
Okay. You know, we never expected the timing to be such that a conference on the Kristallnacht would seem particularly important at this moment, and certainly in the United States. And I think one of the things to me that came out of the conference, and that I would actually like to see more of, is what you talked about, Wolf, which is resistance. Because what we see here, whether it's 1938 in Germany, whether it's the 1930s, you know, when the white supremacists were marching last year in Charlottesville, they were chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." But I can tell you, in again, the place I know best, Los Angeles, from 1933, not just till 1941, but till 1945, virtually every week, somebody was openly calling for death to Jews in the city. And what we see is that there is this persistence of, you know, scapegoating is as old as human beings, basically. We've always looked that there's somebody who's responsible for our misery, somebody who we need to blame. And I think it was particularly interesting, and this was in large part Wolf's research, and what Wolf is really passionate about is understanding that the Holocaust is both unique and not unique. And when we hear about Gujarat, and we hear the same things, to me, the lesson there is you have outbreaks of violence, sometimes spontaneous, sometimes state-sanctioned, sometimes a combination of state-sanctioned and spontaneous. The question is what happens afterwards? What happens at the moment after that violence has occurred? And when does the violence become absorbed into kind of state policy? We see this right now, I would argue, even in our own country. We can't talk about gun control. We can't talk about eliminating one of the causes of violence unless you're Chris Rock and argues, forget about gun control, let's just charge $1,000 a bullet. Think about that. You charge $1,000 a bullet, people think twice about who they're going to shoot at. But to me, what comes out of the conference is more need, and perhaps it's my optimism, because I'm always optimistic that human beings can create a better world, even if it may not be exactly what they thought they were going to create. Human beings can stop hate and can stop repression. How do we resist and how can we learn from the past? To me, that's one of the things for 3 days, that's what I want to know more about, is resistance to this kind of hate, resistance to this kind of violence.
So I think now it's up to you. Who wants? Yeah, sure.
Just one very short remark, as someone who has also worked on resistance and Jewish resistance. I think resistance in '38 was too late. I think what didn't happen or happened too little is resistance in '33, when the democracy was destroyed, the state of law was destroyed, the parties self-destroyed or were destroyed. And I think this is exactly the point, and this is something we can link up to present day. I mean, maybe not yet, but I think that's important. It sounds a little bit boring just to fight for democracy, is something that 20 years ago sounded really boring, but it's not boring anymore. I think that's the message.
Shall I just try to speak up? So that I won't be the mic. Yeah, resistance in Germany, clearly you're right. Resistance in 1938 was too late. But I think that a lot of the countries that at that time had not been conquered by the Nazis yet learned lessons from Kristallnacht. We haven't heard much about that on this conference. In Denmark, for instance, Denmark had adopted a very restrictive refugee policy throughout the mid-30s. And in '38, after Kristallnacht, we're talking about like weeks after Kristallnacht, if not days after, there was a turn in policy towards opening up, not for everyone, but for larger, compared to the number of Jews in Denmark, quite a large contingent, which brought like about 1/4, 25% raise to the Jewish population of Denmark as German refugees. And this was one thing what was learned in that country. Another thing was that you had to fight the Nazis. And that those who had been like, well, Jews have done a lot of bad things and things, so one can understand the reactions of the Germans and things like that. Those kind of opinions became vilified, sort of. And so the, what can you say, the national discourse in countries that became occupied during, after '39 was sort of strengthened in an anti-Nazi tendency through the fact that this was going on in Germany and that there was a lot of reporting locally about it.
And that makes sense because I want to support what you said, that we didn't hear so much about that at our conference, unfortunately, but I would also like to stress and support that the Kristallnacht can certainly not be seen without the big foreign successes that the Nazi regime had in 1938. And that is why I try to stress that the foreign correspondents working on, in, and with Nazi Germany were so that it was the most stressful year for them because they followed all these enormous Nazi successes, and for them the Kristallnacht then only became, cynical as it might sound, a kind of footnote at the end of the super stressful year in which the international system allowed Nazi Germany to occupy or starting to occupy its neighbors. And you know, that is, I can only highly recommend, many of you will already know that book, George Geddes' Fallen Bastions, in which he describes this road to what we now call the Second World War and everything that happened then during in the self-dynamics of the Second World War. But one should definitely see, I think, not separate foreign policy and the international system and what happened then within Nazi Germany or in the occupied territories.
Just one more remark. I just wanted to say, to the best of my knowledge, the man of the year of 1938, according to the Time magazine, was Adolf Hitler. 38, exactly.
The one who has the microphone.
Okay. I want to stress, I mean, after this fascinating conference, it made me really even more conscious and focused on the losses, you know, about this attributing the physicality of those buildings, you know, all around Germany. They all bore a very important history, you know. They have been built for most of them in the 19th century. The history of emancipation, it's a history of art history, you know. And this is not thoroughly studied and reconstructed, you know, the lost synagogue. And again, about the archive, sorry to be so obsessive about that. Again, the Geniza, they burned the Geniza. The Geniza were hidden in the buildings, you know. There's a secret cache in the synagogue, including in the smallest synagogue in the village. And we say, you know, they are kind of used prayer books of no importance. No, they were extraordinarily important that would have permitted, could permit today to write an historical anthropology of those German Jewish communities, you know. Geniza has been found 10 years ago somewhere in southwest Germany. Treasure, manuscript from the 16th century, print books, etc. And this is really lost, you know. Second, and this is also about, you know, my knowledge and having lived in several German towns, you know, a spatialization anthropology of the city. Those synagogues were in the center of the city. The site has and still has a very complex history since 1938. What happened after 45? The memorials, the monument, the reconstruction, the reuse. I'm thinking of Freiburg. You know, the synagogue was in the middle of what is now the university. You know, there has been recently a big controversy about the site. So all these should be open to new research, you know, and comparative approach.
So since I'm not a historian, but I love historians, this is going to be a pitch for maybe much more along the lines of Steve Ross to actually rethink how we can potentially stem the wave of right-wing populist movements and what one can contribute as a historian or as somebody in another discipline. And I do think that, going back to Hasha's point, the issue of coalition building, transnational solidarity, and transatlantic, I guess, partnerships around the issue of maybe stemming waves of anti-Semitism and anti-migration hatred should be so on the agenda. Last week I was at the UN, and as I was walking past some conference room, I was particularly struck by one panel that said, standing committee against the glorification of Nazism. And I thought that was very appropriate. And then I spoke to the Polish representative who somehow was roaming around in hallways rather than being in it. And he said, oh yeah, this has been a standing commission that's been on for a while, but I'm actually wondering, you know, how effective that commission is. So maybe we can also be thinking about translational impacts of what we do into disseminating it into the public sphere. And I wonder what that would look like.
Okay, so I want to go to back to Steve's comment. Thank you so much. To Steve's comment about two prongs. One is the importance of thinking about resistance, both historically and then in the present. And the defense of democracies. And so when we look back to that history, how did the players at the time, I mean not the perpetrators, but the let's say those who were appalled at what was going on, how did they define the kind of resistance they could engage in? And what were the limits to their imagination? How did they understand that what they could do, as I said in my talk, they couldn't know where this was going to go, but so many of them took steps which perhaps in retrospect seem kind of pathetic or that did nothing, but yet there's something about the idea of standing up and the multiple forms that resistance took. And then how do we translate that to the world we live in now? What are the kinds of acts that we as historians can, what can we as historians contribute to thinking about and empowering resistance to what's going on now, using the skills and the strengths we have?
Yeah, sure, you want to?
Oh, there's I'm getting impaled by this. Or not impaled.
I learned a tremendous amount from this. One of them is the relationship of Kristallnacht to the Holocaust. In a way they blended. And I was just looking through something, if I can quote something from one of the people who was there on that. I'll read it in German because it's very touching. Es hat alles in dieser Nacht für uns deutsche Juden aufgehört. Und das ist mehr wie Kristallnacht, zerschlagene Möbel, zerschlagene Elternhäuser oder verbrannte Synagogen. Das war das Symbol. Jetzt ist etwas zerstört, an das wir unser Leben lang geglaubt haben. So there was a destruction there, a kind of caesura in German life, and that was then a kind of a preface or anticipation of the Holocaust. That's one thing. The other is this, that I'm thinking of distinguishing between Vorsicht and Ansicht. By the Vorsicht, we had wonderful presentations here about, I would say, reverberations. It's like just throwing a stone into the lake and you have all these concentric circles. One of the concentric circles that we explored was the geographical, how it went into other countries. The other was in terms of the media, how it was reflected in the media. Another was in terms of the epistemology, how everybody understood it. And so you had these reverberations coming out, almost like a radio signal, into all these areas, so that we were, in this conference, we were able to understand Kristallnacht not as an isolated reality, but something which had reverberations, including, by the way, in addition to the epistemological, also in terms of later years, a chronological reverberation. So that's the Vorsicht, and that's just wonderful. But now I ask about the Ansicht. Now we could never get to the actual moment of Kristallnacht, which was when synagogues were burned, property was burned, people were slaughtered, to the point whereby a victim faced a perpetrator. That moment in and of itself, and that really was Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is not the reverberations. It's not our retroactive trying to understand it from one side or the other. It was that inner moment. And that's, I think, something that we should at least try to get at. And that's where we get to, someone who was forced into the synagogue and had to participate in the burning of the Sefer Torah vis-a-vis the person who forced him. That very moment of encounter is where I think the ultimate reality of Kristallnacht lies. So, the Vorsicht, it was just wonderful, one presentation after the other. But I hope that someday we could get to the Ansicht of the Kristallnacht.
Thank you. So I learned a tremendous amount, from so many people here at this conference, and I want to go back to something that's come up a couple times, in this conversation. Most recently, Hasia was talking about this, about how you can take what we learn, about Kristallnacht and about the Nazi era, and apply it. I think one of the things that was really interesting that came out of the last panel in particular was the challenge of comparison, which is to say that on the one hand, we need to use the tools of comparison in order to explore and explain sort of what's going on in our present moment, but also it kind of ties people's hands when we sort of do it in certain ways. Whether it's kind of a saturation of a society with comparisons with Nazism and the Holocaust, or any other number of ways. And I think it's a real challenge that I think needs to be explored, which is how do we look at the sort of growing, like the increasing levels of passivity within society towards what is happening over the course of the 1930s in Germany, for instance, and think about how the same thing may be happening in terms of all sorts of political things that are happening around the world today in terms of the rise of right-wing authoritarian regimes. But I think there's a lot to delve into and to think about, and hopefully this is just the beginning of sort of people thinking and talking about these things in public and not just in a small room in a beautiful location. So.
You are marching towards the microphone.
What I take away from this conference is that we should focus on what we do best, to work with words and to understand words as they are uttered, and what the utterances really signify and what they imply and to what they lead, and to apply as much care in analyzing in which way words are applied and how what they mean is implemented as possible. And I don't really think that it's so important to distinguish here between right-wing mobilization, for example, or other sloppy ways to think or to do things, but to be as precise. And this is why I also so much appreciated this final comparative panel, because this requires us to do a translatory effort into, when we look at what we are most familiar with, the history of National Socialism and Kristallnacht, to different contexts, and to be as precise in the analysis as we can be. And there we can actually achieve quite a bit, and can learn the tools and teach the tools how to distinguish between what we believe is wrong and what we believe is right.
Yeah, I have to admit I'm a little bit unease about how we discuss this, because I think some of the things that respond to our reality right now, they were there before the conference and they didn't change. And so for me it would be important to see what is different after the conference. Yeah, it's not, I knew there's a need for resist, we need to contribute. But what is different after the conference? Did we get something out of this? What is it? How we see Kristallnacht different after the conference? What are the implications of seeing it different if we do? So I would really rather first talk about this before we can then kind of say, okay, how do we apply this?
I was going to raise a different question. I was going to raise the question of where do we go from here, which is related to what Wolf is saying. There are two elements. Is what have we learned that, in a sense, many of us have gone over familiar territory, adding new kinds of perspectives to it. What I would be, the one thing I think is missing, and it's very hard to get to, and you certainly know, is what's the story of the perpetrators and the bystanders? How do we get to them? Why do people, what do they see themselves doing? Whether they're actively participating or whether they're watching things going on, what are they actually doing? And I just, you know, it totally unrelated, but the psychology is not. One of the techniques I use when I have students who I catch plagiarizing come in is the first thing I ask them is, tell me something, is this your work? And that, the first answer they have determines whether they failed the course and I send their name in, or whether I just give them an F on the exam and give them another break that they can still pass. And many of them, most people who cheat will confess right away. And then I ask them the following question. Was there ever a moment, as you were thinking about cheating, that something in your head said, don't do this, don't do this? And if that moment happened, why didn't you listen to it? Is there a moment that perpetrators are thinking, is there something wrong? Now, this is probably the hardest thing of anything to get to, but when I studied slavery as an undergraduate, we were talking, we can't know the slave mentality, and then all of a sudden there's this explosion of books that give us the slave mentality, slave resistance, slave life, how they thought about the world, by using different kinds of sources and approaching the material in different ways. Could we understand what leads people to do this? Because unless you believe people are born evil, people become acculturated in some ways to believing that this is okay, what they do is okay. But I've got to believe, and maybe it's naive, that somewhere there is that moment they're thinking, is this wrong? Am I doing something wrong? And then they suppress it and go ahead and do it.
Tackle?
I can come right here. Okay, I'm happy to. Good.
Thank you. I just pick up on what you just said, Steve. One way of getting closer to the way the perpetrators saw all these things would be through what you can say microanalysis of the actual acts of violence, trying to decode the messages that they're sending through their non-verbal, probably also verbal, but non-verbal communication with the victims. Why do they perform specific types of violence against property, against people? The semiotics of violence, you could say, could lead us to probably get some insight into the minds of people who didn't leave any written evidence or any Shoah Foundation interviews or anything else behind. But you could say the actual deeds that they performed in that situation. And we would have some sources for that at least. So that might provide some insight if we use it, especially if we can use it like massively, like take a large number of incidents and pull them through that kind of an apparatus of analysis.
Yeah, I think we have two different kind of discussions now
Yeah.
here. And what you were saying refers to the so-called Täterforschung in Germany, which is quite developed actually about the perpetrators, and some say too developed. And I would just like to make two short remarks because this would really be a new conference. And one remark is that I think I'm not as optimistic as you, and I think we, especially from Kristallnacht, we have many evidence, and this was coming up in some papers, that people were enjoying violence, especially when doing it in a group. So apparently, and this is something we still really, we have not really, I mean research in general has not really touched this lust, and to enjoy being violent, and to enjoy torturing or inflicting damage or whatever. So that's one point, and yes, and I think it will be very hard to get at this, of course, because after 45, we had this discussion in the lunch break, after 45, there were trials against the perpetrators, so that it was established that it was bad, and if you confess having been a perpetrator, you might go on trial, even though it didn't happen too much, but at least the chances were there. While, and this is the example I have in mind, in Spain, this was not the case, and you have documentaries from the 70s, where you have perpetrators from the Francoist side telling very freely how it felt killing people, shooting them torturing them, and how it was at the beginning sometimes difficult, but then you got used to it and you could even enjoy it and you had your friends. So this is a kind of material we will never have from Germany for the obvious reasons. We do have it from other countries. So that's one thing I wanted to say into this direction of the discussion, and into the question that Wolf raised, which is really difficult.
What have we learned now?
What have we learned now? No, I think, what has changed from here? I mean, and I said this, I think I said it before, I think there are two things that I find very important when we deal with the year 38 or Kristallnacht or whatever. The one thing I said before is the taboo breaking. The other thing Norman also mentioned, and I think this came up in many papers, is the importance of the international politics and the international constellation. Because it was not that nor the Soviet Union, nor the United States, nor Great Britain attacked Germany for what it was doing, but they were attacked. And then in the end, I know in 41, the US joined in, but it was not that there was an international reaction to what was happening. And I think this is something very important to keep in mind. And the last thing, I think it would be interesting to have a conference which joins what the topics we were dealing here, and the persecution of Jews in Germany, was the question of German resistance. Because there was German resistance, and many, I mean, there's 33 people, as I said in one moment at the conference, I mean, tens of thousands were in the concentration camps, but there still were communist cells, there were social democrat cells, and if you look then at the resistance group during the war, the most famous is the so-called Rote Kapelle or the Herbert Baum group, and if you look at the history, there are hundreds and hundreds of people who helped them. Helping means giving them food rations or letting them stay in their homes, and many of them are what we would call ordinary Germans. So, and this is, but we never see this together. We do old Jewish history or German resistance history, and I think it might be interesting to join this because it were the same people sometimes, and resistance in the 40s meant giving help to those who were persecuted, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I wanted just to add, when we think about this, what you call the break of a taboo, the kind of very personal violence, not just, but against everybody, but especially against women, I would actually add that Kristallnacht, first of all, it demands a lot of new research to really look into this better. But I want to add, actually, not just in 1938, because from my research on the ground with police reports, you have acts, more isolated acts, I would say, already in 1935 against women. Yeah, beating up of a Jewish woman in Berlin by two stormtroopers, and for no reasons. I found this only because I'm interested in resistance, because the Jewish neighbor was actually defending these two Jewish ladies and beat up the stormtroopers. So, I mean, in a way, what I wanted to say is that why we have this climax, and which is kind of still hard to explain, this collective violence, there is kind of also already a build-up, and this makes it even more kind of not harder to explain, but how can I put this? It's actually normalizes it in a way, yeah. And I think this is even then leads us to the other aspect of comparison. I think this is then it doesn't seem so unexplainable if there is already a build-up to it, yeah.
All right, we're going to add, going back to Will's point, what did we learn? I learned from Francois that we need to be much more careful in what the terminology is. How do we want to talk about this? Because words do matter. Whether it's a pogrom, a terror, state-sponsored violence, genocide, those terms are all gradations, and each term matters because each term leads to a higher level of violence. And it gets into what you're saying, Stefanie, that you can pinpoint then reactions at different moments in time in 1933. I mean, it's not Kristallnacht, but it's still, there is violence. What do we want to call it? Those words matter.
Maybe we give it back to you now.
Seated in that strategic place.
First, really, I appreciate and thank
Oh, I'm sorry.
all the presenters of all the different papers represented here. Quite a few of them I missed, unfortunately, because lack of information of not having only one phone number, part of the initial program to communicate with whoever it is and come to. So almost half of it is missed. But the bottom line, so maybe what I'm going to say or ask has already been tackled with, and I'm sorry if it sounds like repetitive. There is a saying that if I were to live my life all over again, I will do the same mistakes, but sooner. And the other line, whoever does not learn from his past is doomed to relive it all over again. I would like to find out in conclusion, whatever happened, could there be a statement, but an enforced statement, to be followed and partaken in by international governments, where all of these governments would agree to this statement and to do the action immediately when these events do happen again anywhere in the world, no matter which race or creed or country, what, and hopefully if there would be another seminar that would tackle only this issue and be shared with all these universities and hopefully to be sent to all the governments and have an international agreement that if ever anything like this happens again anywhere, that there is indeed an action to be immediately taken by international, not by the UN, unfortunately, finally takes only one side and playing games with it. Really, really, either a movement or an international government taking action to immediately stop it anywhere in the world. That would have been worth it to have indeed have learned from the past we heard of today from the different parts of the world. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to say that I think that it became very clear again that the year 1938 and the November pogroms have this function of like a key role, that they were a key year. And I think it also became clear that we need more research on the ground, like more research, local research in different areas of Germany to first to understand the perspective of the perpetrators, their motivation, but also to understand better the different and various strategies of resistance, and also to learn from those strategies to understand the political situation today and to see what worked out, what didn't work out. And the second point is that I want to say that I'm really struck by the point or the fact like how political this conference became in the end, and that we all the time like make these comparisons between the past and the present. And that's really interesting for me because usually historians tend to be more passive in a way that they are always telling me, oh, I'm just a historian and I don't want to be political. So that's really interesting for me, and I think we, as we already said, we need to use our skills and to go out and like to bring our knowledge to a non-academic audience. I think it's really important.
So this is, I guess, partly in the form of a confession, which is until 2016, was one of those historians who said my politics are over here and my scholarship is over here and never shall the twain meet. And probably somebody could read between the lines and slightly dissect, you know, what I was thinking. For me personally, and this is really, again, this is not like group therapy here, but maybe it is, you know, the events of 2016 really were a life-changing moment for me. And so earlier that year, I had been approached by Yale University Press to do a one-volume history of immigration to the United States, you know, starting in the 17th century. And my answer, I said, absolutely not, it's too much, get a younger scholar to do that. And there was the second request. I said, really, I'm not going to do it. And then the morning after, it's almost we know exactly what after what, I wrote to them back and said, I'll do it. And then I felt that, not that I'm going to write a different history than I would have written a year earlier or 2 years earlier. The fact, you know, the empirical scholar, you know, the scholarship is still the same and the facts are the same and so on. But I felt as a historian, I'm sure the introduction, I know because I've already written it, is pretty pointed. That's my contribution. Okay. And I think, you know, and it may make no difference, and it may be purely to salve my conscience, but I think in some ways, all of the things we can think of so many ways in which doing what we do best and what we know how to do, and marketing, and I don't mean in a sense of making money marketing, but the way it's packaged can be directed at those larger social projects, or political projects.
I would like to, what is different? I think I thought more carefully about how difficult it was to comprehend what actually happened through the various papers, looking at the echoes in the press and in the media. And what we've learned is that there was a very deliberate attempt to mute information about what had happened. We heard this in the case from, of a very clear top-down policy of the BBC not to have any information about the anti-Jewish atrocities to be disseminated through the BBC, but also other instances where people were just not interested, or it somehow shifted to the background, etc. The very noble idea of an international alliance to hit where somebody is doing something like that is obviously would be nice if we could do it, but probably we can't. But I mean, to raise awareness is obviously a very important part of what we are of an engaged historiography. I mean, to say what is happening in some contexts, for example, the war in Yemen. Everybody is now very engaged in the context of the Khashoggi murder. but that Saudi Arabia has been involved in a war effort against Yemen for some logical, strategic reasons, but with massive humanitarian catastrophic consequences, has not triggered the same reaction, interestingly enough. And I mean, over the past 2 weeks, I have to say, I was a great fan of Macron, but when he said, well, unfortunately, we can't not sell our weapons to Saudi Arabia, I thought, okay, that's really taking away from the European project, which I would really like to see supported. One element here is that people do not really understand what is going on because the information doesn't get through. So we could learn a lot about how information is controlled, and this is something we certainly should take on board.
So it's not the way we would usually think about the question of resistance, but maybe thinking about what needs to be done. And I think Stefanie, you said by 1938, a lot of this was already too late to do a lot of things. So maybe that's the warning. And so then we begin rolling back. So what was it that could have been done? Thinking about your question, Steve, earlier. And what is it? Well, it's the extreme and ever-increasing polarization in German society, so that there's no communication that's possible or can occur across the political divides that are developing in German society. And to draw a parallel with where we are today, I think of Arlie Russell Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land, where she went, and she's a very liberal-minded sociologist from Berkeley, California, and she said, well, I have to go talk to these people who are supporting the Tea Party and try to understand what the position is. And I would take that as a form of resistance in one sense, which is to try to understand the other side, open up that dialogue, and not to confuse the ugliness of some of the leaders that they choose to support, but then for them to also lose their humanity. And what she found was that these people actually have all sorts of redeemable characteristics, but the conversation is being closed down between where they are and where other liberal progressives are in society. So I would put that out as maybe as a part of a challenge, as a form of resistance, which is to try to maintain a civil society and to keep that sort of dialogue open in some way. Because that's part of what Kristallnacht was able to achieve, or sort of more of an endpoint of all that, which is the ultimate destruction of that civil society. Something that I remember from reading the interviews of German Berliners, and when they decided to try to help Jews, and when it finally came to the point of the Holocaust, was that all of them felt completely alone. And I think that's part of what Kristallnacht did, was it created a sense of powerlessness amongst everybody. It was a destruction of German civil society. And something else that struck me in terms of the perceptions of, and I'm not saying what the answer is, but coming back to Mary Douglas's discussion about bystanders and perpetrators, is that almost every time I read an account of how a Jew perceived what had happened was that they felt, they didn't expect any help from the other side, so they didn't ask. But every time that and that's something that created that unbridgeable divide between the two communities. If they didn't expect any help from the other side, and they probably would have received more help if they felt that it was still available to them. But that's how part of what Kristallnacht accomplished, was the destruction of that civil society. So I would say part of an act of resistance is to try to maintain that civil society, and also look for ways to reach across whatever partisan divides there are. I think that can be an important component of that.
John, I want to let me pick up on what you were saying, Hasi. I'm on the other end. I've never separated my politics from my scholarship. Every book, every article I've written has been written because I'm interested in the politics of the subject. That said, I approach each one as a serious archival historian. And what I try to do, where I try to take my politics, particularly in the last 10 years, I've been active writing op-ed pieces. But the one thing I've learned in writing op-ed pieces is I don't write for the already converted. I write for that big group in the middle that doesn't quite necessarily know how to think, or you can show them, perhaps, how you might want to think about it. And just as a strategy, what I've discovered is people want to hear a story. They want to hear a story. And so what I've tried to do is take whatever I have flurries of op-eds that come out when the book comes out, because that's when I'm really thinking about everything. And I try to tell the story. And I try to tell it in a way that would engage a reader, that doesn't seem polemical, and then at the very end, try to slip in a political message, whether it's, what do you do when hate moves from the margins to the mainstream, and government authorities either seem complacent or complicit? Well, it's up to every citizen to stand up to protect every other citizen, regardless of their race, their religion, or their ethnicity. That is not a left or right message. To me, that's an American message, and that's what I try to appeal to. So it's about also strategy of how do you reach your public. And the other thing I will beg you in your writing, don't use jargon. Don't, because if you want somebody to read your book, not just buy your book, but read your book, you have to make it an engaging read. And none of us, at least my experience is, none of us are ever taught how to write. We're just taught the academic form, but we're not taught how to engage readers. And I spend a lot of time, and I would suggest we all need to spend a lot of time thinking about how do we want to tell our story.
Yeah, well, I will make it very short, because Wolf says we have to end now, but I will give you my book on the German Jewish resistance fighter, which is well written, I think. But very short remark. I think I very much appreciate what this reaching out thing. But I just wanted to say that in Germany, this discussion is dividing up the left liberals, and we call it the question mit rechten reden. Should we talk to people on the far right who are racist and anti-Semites, etc., etc.? So where's what is acceptable into the discourse or not? But I don't want to open this now, but I just want to say this is a serious question and a division in Germany at least. And the second thing is about, I don't think that in 38 was a moment where German Jews realized that they didn't want to ask for help anymore or had no one to talk to. I think this was 33. And those, social relations were breaking up in 33 and 34, and those who did not break up, they also kept stable after 38. But I think the crucial moment of this feeling, what was the phrase of Joachim Prinz? We are neighborless. Yeah, I think this is 33, and 38 is a different point in time.
So I actually want to just wrap up, but I need to add something to this, because although this looks like a very kind of downhill development when you just described from 33 with kind of cutting out these relationships, but when you look at the ground, actually there's also another side, which is, on the one hand, violence is not kind of stopping everything. What I try to do in my paper, there was even Jewish resistance after this massive assault. But on the other hand, is also what I realized when you do microhistory, you realize, yes, there is a lot of social relations, personal relationships which are cut off, which are destroyed, which end. But there are some also newly established, which is interesting, which you don't expect, and actually go despite all circumstances. And I think this should also tell us something, that there is always a way that people make different choices. And I think it is about these individual choices, which is so important. So this is now really the wrap up. I want to say what I thought it will haunt me when I started the conference, when I with the kind of the words that people told me this is so timely, and I we just realized this, how kind of the timeliness of this event is kind of also impacting our thinking, our discussion right now at the end. So there is really truth to this, although we never anticipated it. So sometimes in the kind of what happens seems to have to happen, right? So in a way, yeah, I mean when I planned this, I never thought this would come. Okay, this was my bad
Otherwise, we would never
phrasing.
have conferences anymore.
No. And then sometimes something comes out of it what you don't plan. And I think this was important to have this conference. I really want to thank each and every one of you for your contributions in different ways. I think some of the things we discussed here, even either academically or politically, will kind of continue for the time between us, but also with others. And I hope this might be also important to actually extend these conversations to other people, be it colleagues or friends. And so this is what I want to conclude with. And thanks again to the staff, Isabella, Marema, and Martha, and the Villa Aurora, my co-chairs, my co-sponsors.
Since I'm just a sidekick here, I would say thank you to Wolf Gruner and Jussi Grossford.